Hi, this is Hadi from Olympian High School. We've been studying Chapter 37 on World War II, and this is going to be a lecture that's difficult to listen to. We're going to be learning about one of the largest genocides in human history. It's called the Holocaust. Many of you have learned about it in the past, and we'll be adding to the knowledge that you already have. And looking at how the Holocaust came to be with many changes in Nazi policy over time. I think many students come to class thinking that the German Nazi Party had always planned to exterminate the Jews. And one of the changes that you have to make in your thinking is that this actually was a change in policy. And it comes to be called the final solution, that initially the Nazis were not necessarily planning on exterminating or killing all Jews. So the first thing I want to say is just that this is a difficult topic. And it can be very unsettling and disturbing for students, and that it's going to take a lot of study to learn this topic appropriately. So I have a master's in education, and I was pursuing a master's in history at San Diego State. One of my professors was incredibly knowledgeable in the Holocaust, and I remember we had a long conversation one day after class about his difficulty sleeping after he had studied the Holocaust so much because it was so disturbing, and he just had a hard time sleeping. There's also debate about the Holocaust. The debate, for example, about how the number of people whose lives were lost, and some people who survived the Holocaust. It's re-traumatizing to discuss it again. We can also compare this genocide in history to other genocides like the Armenian Genocide that you may have studied that many Americans don't even know about. Obviously, this is the most well-known genocide, but just understanding that scholarship of the Holocaust is challenging work, and it can be very draining and exhausting, and that there's disagreement about the numbers in terms of the Holocaust and how to teach it appropriately. So to do a good job learning the Holocaust, you have to spend a long time. And just learning a little bit about it in one class is not going to be sufficient. And you'll need to continue your studies as you get older, and that there are a lot of lessons to learn about not going along with things, not being apathetic to policies that are discriminatory towards others and how quickly they can escalate, and paying attention to that. In the politics of our daily lives and the types of leaders that we choose, and racism, anti-Semitism, prejudice. Okay, so one of the things you need to know is that, generally speaking, the accepted number for how many lives were lost is roughly 6 million, 5.7 million in your book. Some people claim that it's a higher number, some people claim that it's a lower number, but let's just say it's about 5.7 or 6 million. And that it didn't just target Jews. There were also anybody that was considered to be racially inferior, so someone that had like a mental health illness or wore glasses or was deaf, Slavic people, gypsies, which are now, it's more appropriate to call them Roma, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, communists, anybody else that was undesirable was targeted. So initially, this was preceded by a long history of anti-Semitism that most people in Europe were apathetic to. So Jewish people, there have been pogroms against Jewish people, for example, in Russia. When nationalism increased as an ideology that was gaining momentum throughout Europe, many people saw Jewish communities as outsiders, foreigners, and so they accepted anti-Semitic rhetoric. And that's really important to understand because it made people apathetic to defending the Jews and to stopping some of the escalation of the measures. So we need to bear that in mind for our current politics. Okay, so not very many people came to the defense of Jewish groups. As I mentioned, I really need you to understand that this policy changed. Initially, the Nazi policy was to encourage emigration, so leaving the country, pushing Jews to leave the country. And Jewish people had a very hard time doing this because prior to the pushing for Jewish emigration, the Nazis had basically stripped the Jewish people of much of their wealth by forcing them to sell out their businesses and making it so that it was, like you guys learned about Kristallnacht in the past, the night of broken glass. And so it was very difficult for Jewish people because they were impoverished to find a country that would accept them. And there's, cases of ships that were turned back when they tried to leave and go to places like America, for example. So, okay, when the Nazis really start when they come to power in 1933, they're coming to power in this very anti-Semitic climate, and they're toying with all kinds of ideas for what they can do about the Jewish problem. One idea was to take them all and send them to one place, but for example, like Madagascar. But they were afraid of what that might look like if too many Jewish people were in one area. Would they potentially create a state? And they developed this idea of what we call the final solution, the idea of exterminating all Jewish people, killing all Jewish people, murdering them all, in 1942 at the Wannsee Conference. Prior to this, before I get to that, let's look at some of the things that they did. The Nazis used to dispatch groups called the Einsatzgruppen, or the action squads, to kill Jewish people, Slavic people, Jewish people, Gypsies, or Roma, in some of the territories of Eastern Europe and Russia. So there were mass shootings where they killed people in ravines or in ditches. Thousands of people were killed that way. And then, as I said, at the Wannsee Conference in 1942, 15 of the leading Nazi bureaucrats coordinated, and they agreed to send all Jewish people from Europe to camps in eastern Poland, where they would either be worked to death or killed in these concentration camps. And so people from all parts of Europe were gathered up, rounded up, and sent by train cars to the different concentration camps, and many people died along the way because the train cars didn't have good ventilation, so some of the sick and elderly died en route. You can see many of the major concentration camps where they're located. So I've been to this one, to Birkenau, Auschwitz, one of the largest concentration camps. And to be honest, I really didn't want to go. I went with students once. We were traveling through a trip on Eastern Europe, and I knew it was going to be unsettling, but ultimately I am grateful for the experience because it made it even more real. And the day that we went, it was misty and gloomy and just like a depressing feeling. And you can see the quiet town outside of the concentration camp. And it was, I think, an important reminder that these kinds of terrible things can happen under our nose, and that this is a reality. This isn't just something you read in a book, that people experience this. And we saw where people went to the bathroom, and we saw the luggages that people wrote their names on, being fooled into that they'll one day retrieve their luggage, and some of the items and the shoes that people left behind. So it just made it feel more real. Sometimes we get disconnected from the history and we feel like, oh, this is like, we get into the narrative. Every person, the millions of people that died in the Holocaust, that was a real human being like you and I that experienced this tragedy. So if you have the chance at one point in your life, even though it's going to be really heart-wrenching to go, I encourage you to go, just to, sit with that and really reflect on what a tragedy this was, and how we should do everything we can to not allow things like that to take place in an apathetic manner. And there's things like this that are still happening. If we talk about the treatment of the Rohingya, for example, or if we talk about what China is doing with the Uyghurs, like, we need to pay attention when things like this are happening and do our best to stand up against it. Okay, so you'll read about the many concentration camps. The one I really need you to remember about is Auschwitz. And there were many ways that people were killed, machine gunning them into open pits. But one of the most terrible ways was by using a poison gas. Some people that went to these concentration camps were tricked and lulled into thinking they were going to take a shower. And they were in this big shower with other people, when really what was being released was poison gas, Zyklon B. So eventually, this murder of an ethnic group, that's why it's called a genocide, is eventually going to be termed a crime against humanity. Now, many Jewish people resisted, but of course, it's difficult to resist when you're half-starved, when you're sick, when you've been mistreated or tortured. But many people did resist. You have anti-Nazi partisan groups, resistance movements, and you also have a very famous uprising in one of the ghettos, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943, where 60,000 Jews stood up against the Nazis, and it took weeks for the Nazis to crush the uprising. So again, remember the number, 5.7 million Jews that perished in the Holocaust. Understand about the concentration camps, many of which were in Poland, and know that this was an escalation of Nazi policies. The Nazis didn't start off as saying they were going to kill all the Jews, and that's eventually where they landed. And so it's something to keep in mind when people say, well, this isn't that bad. Things can always get worse. So you have to be careful who you put into power. Okay, so I mentioned this about who was targeted. Initially, the policy was to encourage emigration. Ideas to send them to a reservation in Poland or to Madagascar were abandoned when there were fears about the potential for the Jews to create their own state. We talked about the Einsatzgrupping, following the German army into the Soviet Union, into Eastern Europe, rounding up Jews and killing them into open pits with machine guns. We talked about the final solution at the Wannsee Conference. You have to know the Wannsee Conference and when it was. And then you know about the concentration camps and the poison gas. Many of the corpses were destroyed in crematoria, and we know about the number of Jews that perished in the Holocaust. And we talked about Auschwitz, specifically Birkenau Auschwitz, and also about Jewish resistance and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.